Bruce, over the years, I'm sure you have tried cases in front of many judges in this area. Are there any particular judges for which you have special memories?
Oh, yes, there's no question about that. That's Dayton E. Phillips. Dayton E. Phillips was elected to Congress after he returned from World War II, while B. Carroll Reese was playing chairman of the Republican National Committee. This is 46, 48, and so Dayton gets elected to Congress, and he serves 2 terms. Supports Truman's veto of Taft-Hartley. Very pro-labor record as a Republican, entirely opposite B. Carroll Reese. And he gets beat by B. Carroll Reese when he's running for re-election. Dayton does. So Dayton waits around for about a year or 2 and then runs for chancellor, the first chancellor district here in Upper East Tennessee. Dayton Phillips was from Carter County. And we jokingly used to say that Dayton Phillips, when asked what the job of a chancellor was in Upper East Tennessee, would say, the job of a chancellor in Upper East Tennessee is to see that the insurance company's money is equitably distributed among the people. He was a great believer in equity in that regard. He was a very, very, very colorful person.
During your first 15 to 20 years of practice here in this area,
yes,
was there a lawyer, or perhaps more than one, that the legal community looked to as the lawyer's lawyer?
Yeah, one would be Howard Wilson, for Wilson Worley. And the other is a lawyer whose name I cannot remember for the life of me, practiced law with Tad Cox and Jim Epps, and Ferdinand Powell. Ferdinand Powell was a repository of federal civil procedure. He had been an assistant United States attorney. His wife was the sister of Governor Prentice Cooper. He just was an extraordinary man. Ferdinand always wore, until probably July, corduroy pants that were never ironed, and it was kind of sloppy in that sense. But he was a brilliant lawyer and a very fine human being.
What distinguished Mr. Wilson and made him the lawyer's lawyer?
I think it was his style, his demeanor. He was truly a gentleman. And Joe Worley, practiced with him, was a very distinguished person, too. I remember Mr. Worley told me when I was a young lawyer with McClellan, trying to try a case one day, settle a case one day with Mr. Worley. He said, looked at me, he said, my, young man, you've got sugar plums in your head. And then later on in the discussion, he said, you're awfully liberal with someone else's money. He represented the insurance company and the establishment. But Mr. Worley and Mr. Wilson were very, very distinguished people that I knew. And then there was a lawyer here that some people have forgotten, and that is Ed Norris. Ed Norris with the firm of Hunter, Smith and Davis. And Smith was an interesting and distinguished man. But Ed Norris recommended me, for instance, for my AV rating when I was in my mid-30s. He just was a very, a lot of people thought he was, had different opinions of him. But I remained a great fan of Ed Norris. He died young, too young.
Would you describe your accent as an East Tennessee accent?
Hell no.
Have you ever noticed people either admiring or questioning your accent?
Well, my accent really is very much Virginia and mixture of New England. You know, I recognize that I don't have an East Tennessee accent, and I've not considered that a disadvantage, and in all kindness. But my accent, where I learned how to speak and everything, was probably Virginia, and mixture of going to school up in New England mixed it too.
You have mentioned lawyers' styles and something else which I will return to in a minute. But over the years, were there particular lawyers whose styles you sought to emulate in order to improve your manner of presentation as a lawyer?
I think I stole from a lot of people. You know, I cannot say there's any one particular lawyer that I ever went and sought and to listen to all day long so I'd be as good as he. But there are lawyers that I've known over the years that I, you know, noted things that they have done in ways they've looked like a lawyer. I think one of the great problems today is that many young lawyers don't look like lawyers. They're sloppy. They're, you know, they think they come to in chino pants that have never been washed or pressed, and you know, you see some of them, and you'd think that they just don't look like lawyers. And I was told as a young lawyer, if you're going to charge like a lawyer, you damn well better look like a lawyer.
Well, you anticipated the other question, which was how the sartorial aspect has changed over the years.
I think it's terrible. I think they ought to get up in the morning and dress like they're going to end up at the Supreme Court before the day's out. Because you know, when I first started practicing law, you never knew when a judge was going to call you in. I mean, you know, now there's some people who never go to court and have dressed like they go to court. And I once represented a podiatrist who's no longer anywhere near us in 11 malpractice suits. And I remember going, I said to him, you know, and this is true of many doctors today and dentists. I said, you dress like I've interrupted your golf game. And, you know, and this guy, his office was absolutely dirty as could be. And I told him, I said, no wonder people are suing you. We're going to get a professional cleaner to come here and wash the walls and the floors and everything else. And you're going to stop wearing a polo shirt to work. I said, you're going to wear a shirt and tie and a jacket that says doctor on it, and you're going to act like a doctor.
Bruce, during your career, you have served as a general counsel for various labor unions.
Yes.
How did that come about?
We had a strike at Leon Fehrenbach in the early 70s.
What was Leon Fehrenbach?
Leon Fehrenbach was a textile operation in Johnson City. The United Textile Workers had organized it. After they organized it, they did a very poor job of signing up people and got into negotiations that were unsuccessful. And the person for the textile workers in charge of it was a lazy guy, and he got them to call a strike. Called a strike, they're totally unprepared for, union and pride company. And he allowed some of the strikers to have bats and all kinds of stuff. Bernie Cantor, who I've mentioned earlier, Harvard Law School graduate, very good lawyer in Johnson City, was representing the union. He was pro-labor. He was an arbitrator. But he really always wanted to be a judge, okay? And so he never really liked lawsuits where you know, you were not going to have any friends when it was all over. and he lived in Johnson City. And so the union came to me 4 times and asked me to take over the case, and I didn't want to because it was Bernie's case. I felt very strongly you don't steal other lawyers' business. And finally, on the 4th occasion, I agreed. And I asked them why they came to me, and they said they wanted a showboat lawyer. And I thought that was a bizarre kind of comment. And so I became their showboat lawyer and represented them very successfully in the strike, and in particularly one situation where the president of the local had been charged with hiring a person who unfortunately was an alcohol and taxation agent to blow up a generator thing like that at the Fahrenbach plant. And the damn fool had got in the car, in a truck with his tax and firearms and what have you agent, and proceeded to tell him that if he would blow up this generator, we had 2 strikes going on in Ohio, and we could send him up there to do it. And he took money that the International had sent down for the strike relief. International knew nothing about this, but they traced the money, and it was their money. And so I got the guy to plead guilty because otherwise he was going to be convicted quite clearly. And Judge Neese was kind enough to seal the transcript of everything so that the union could never be sued for inciting this, similar to what the lawsuit I had later on in West Virginia against the mine workers. And so during the course of that, a lawyer named Izzy Katz in New York that had represented the textile workers quit or died. He also was general counsel of the Musicians Union, very prominent labor lawyer. And Frank Schaffenbill, the president of the textile workers, and they were headquartered then in Massachusetts, decided he wanted, along with his director of organization, a guy named Gernert, both very wonderful people from Wisconsin, decided that I should succeed this New York prominent labor lawyer as general counsel. And so I became general counsel of the United Textile Workers. I was 32 years old. I was the youngest general counsel in the AFL-CIO. Schaffenbill, there's a photograph of him in this office hanging up. He started the union in Prairie du Chien. He worked at a felt plant. Felt plants they make felt when they're making textiles for the base for the textile to go over. And so felt plants are very important. And he went in the morning to go and to, bluntly put, move his bowels at about 8:30 in the morning in the plant. He was a 25-year-old whippersnapper. And they had one of those old toilets where you pull the chain down and the water came down on a pole pipe and what have you. And it came down, but it didn't continue to go down. It proceeded then to come back up. And on Frank Schaffenbill. And so he decided they needed a union at that plant. And so he became a very strong, and he was you could walk into a room and he could be sitting there with 50 people and you knew he was the president of the union. He was a man of great distinction. He had no college education, but yet he wrote for every issue of the Textile Challenger, our newspaper, a historical page on some activity of the union. He was shrewd, sharp, smart. And then my friend Larry Poltrock became general counsel of the American Federation of Teachers. I didn't know him beforehand, but Larry's about a year older than I am, and we two were the 2 youngest general counsels in the AFL-CIO at that time, and probably for about 10 years, because everyone else was so old.
You mentioned a newspaper as our newspaper. Do you mean the local paper here?
Oh, yeah. I mean, no, I was talking about the newspaper for the textile workers.
I see.
The Textile Challenger, which was our newspaper that we published and sent to our members. We had about 65,000 members in the United States and Canada. And, of course, the textile industry at that point was dying. And so later on, years later, I said I sometimes felt like a mortician, because as the textile industry died, we continued to lose members.
You mentioned a case in West Virginia, and it may be the one you choose to speak of, but is there one example of a trial that you were involved in over your career that is of special significance for you?
As I told you at lunch, I've practiced in at least 20 states in front of agencies and state courts. I think the case in West Virginia was one of the more interesting ones because the characters involved. There are about 7 or 8 lawyers. The federal judge who heard it in Charleston was a delightful old man. We had 60 days of pretrial, depositions and what have you. It dealt with a strike over a coal preparation plant, which is building a plant where you bring the coal in and then prepare it to go out. And the United Mine Workers were of the opinion that my client, which was headquartered in this building, had a contract with the United Steelworkers. And they didn't think that was good enough. You had to have it with the mine workers. And so a couple hundred of them one day came marching down the street in a riot form and turned over the trailer that's always at every construction site and knocked it over. Thank God we left someone, I don't know who it was, left the tape recorder running as they left the building for fear of being turned over with the building. And it was a terrible situation. It was bad for the union, it was bad for the company, it was bad for everyone. And it was the same company that the gentleman in West Virginia who recently was indicted and tried over having spent $1 million to defeat someone. Anyway,
Massey Coal Company.
It's the Massey Coal Company that we were doing the work for, and we had the 60 days of preparation, depositions, and what have you. We started the trial on the day after Labor Day, and every Monday or Sunday afternoon, I would fly up to Charleston, West Virginia, in a company plane that Massey provided, so that I could, and I had 2 rooms at the Marriott Hotel, and if you listen to Prairie Home Companion on public radio in Knoxville, they have a program that comes every Saturday night from Charleston, and it just started, the program. And so I stayed there. I had 2 rooms. I never checked out from the day after Labor Day till the end of October. The end of October, the jury came back, and there was a big argument as to, we found out later, as to whether to give us $6 million or nothing. And they finally settled on 1.6. The reason I remember this trial is that my mother died during it. And it was toward the end. And my mother was ill, and had been, and she had a very strong rule. She did not want to see me the last 30 days of her life. because she had primary biliary cirrhosis. She was not a drinker, but that's what she had. And it weakened her, and she did not want me ever to think back upon her in a reduced state, in a hospital, dying. I would make appointments to visit my mother a week or two ahead of time, and they would last for an hour and a half. They were normally in the afternoon, outside when they could be. Tea, some cookies, and what have you. But anyway, in the course of it, of the trial, one afternoon, I stood up and I looked, and there was Betsy and David in the audience. And I knew something was wrong. We took our afternoon break. I think that was like on a Wednesday. And I asked, and I said, you know, the funeral and all that has to be on Saturday. And it was strange in that I never told anyone. I just went to the federal judge, because we had 7 or 8 lawyers there. It was, you know, and everyone had their schedule and what have you. And I was expecting my mother's death. I didn't, you know, it never comes easy. And so I asked to leave early on Friday. And I flew up to Boston and buried her. The AP had a small little story on her that somehow or another got into the Charleston newspaper, and they found out about it. But I went back to work Monday morning and tried that case. We won it, and it was a thing that my mother would have wanted me to do.
Are there other examples in your career where you have overcome difficulties like that in order to represent the interests of your clients?
Oh, yes. I've had some. 6 years ago with cancer and some. I have never felt that I needed to share my situation with the rest of the world in a sense that it was a burden upon them. And so, you know, if I just sent a bill off to a client, far too little bill, but I agreed to do the work, and that's for a law enforcement agency that I have a kind of a special, I go to where police have used their guns. And I had a recent shooting incident of some national report. And so I go and I meet with the police officers and I talk with them and I tell them about their Garrity rights and I talk about other things like that and help calm the situation, because, you know, many of these police officers work their entire life and have never used their weapon. It's a significant thing to pull a weapon and shoot someone. And it's not something to be taken lightly, and it doesn't really impact the officer at that time, but after the fact, and it becomes more difficult. I agreed years ago for this police organization to do it at so much an hour. I won't even go into it, I'm almost embarrassed. My associate is paid more an hour. And, but I continue to bill them that because I told them I would.
Bruce, so much of your practice has been on the road. How do you live on the road and practice law, and what advice would you give to others as they attempt to do the same thing?
I haven't done it as much in recent years, Howard. There was a time where every week I was going somewhere, doing something. I think that you have to have a sympathetic wife if you're married. I was very fortunate that Betsy's father is president of Eastman Chemical Products and 4 other subsidiaries of Kodak. He was president of the company in Argentina. He was in Zug, Switzerland, and he had offices on 6th Avenue in New York, and in South America and everywhere. And Betsy grew up with a father that was flying around, and understood that the role was to be helpful. Because you jolly well can make life unbearable if you're some willy-nilly, and I won't say from what Smithville County in Tennessee, and you can't have your husband go off to a Lions convention for 2 days once every 3 years. And we know women like that. And we know men who wouldn't go anywhere. So I think you need a sympathetic wife. Number 1. Number 2, you need to decide what is and what is not important. And you need to decide whether you're just chasing rainbows or doing something that really is some significance. I can say, Howard, that when I got up this morning, far too early, I knew I was going to like today because I have a law license. I knew I was going to enjoy what I was going to do today, even though when you go, I'm going to go over some other things that involve the practice. You have to like what you're doing. And if you like what you're doing, it doesn't make any difference whether you're doing it in Santa Monica. I mean, as I say, I've practiced law in 20 states. In courts and agencies, you know, and some of them haven't. One of the reasons I always dress the way I do. One time in Wisconsin, I walked into a courtroom, and the judge came out, and he said, I assume you represent the company, and I say no. He does. And the sloppy lawyer, dressed like that, with a beard, excuse me, and the beard, I said, no, I represent the company. I once had a young man who wanted a job with his firm, and I told him he had to get rid of his beard. And he asked me why. And this was some years back. I'm a very moderate conservative soul. And I said, my clients have enough problems. In those days, I was in strikes and unfair labor practices and things like that. And my clients had enough problems that I didn't want to walk into a courtroom and have my red beard, let's say, alienate one member of the jury or a judge or someone. And so I've always been, I'm like, well, I'm bland and I'm dull. And I want to be that way. If I'm going to be the showboat lawyer, I want to be leading people down a parade that they're glad to be in. I don't want to be, you know, fighting the traffic coming up the stairs.
There was a point, you're well established in your career, and you decide you wanted to go back for a little bit more legal education. How did that come about?
Well, I had 2 sons in graduate school. One, Edward, was at the international, at the Naval School at Monterey, earning his master's in international economics. David, my youngest son, was a student earning his master's degree in history at the University of Edinburgh. And I decided it was about time that I did something for myself that I'd wanted to do for a long time. And that was to earn a master's degree in EU employment law. Absolutely no value whatsoever. My law partner at the time used to say it's going to help us a lot getting cases in Bluntful. But I reminded him, or he didn't need to be, because he never knew about it. But I had an economics professor at Tusculum who once said there are 2 types of economic income, real and psychic, and that psychic was the most important because it allowed, you earned real income, and then you're able to take care of it psychic. And so I went to the University of Leicester in England, which is one of the 5 top law schools in England. And they had a program where you came in every 2 months for about a year and a half, 2 years, and studied, and at the conclusion of which you could earn a master's degree or a certificate. It was broken down into 5 modules. In this book here, we would get 2 of these every time we went to Leicester or someplace. We went to classes in Edinburgh, we went in Brussels and everywhere in Europe, in the market. And this book we had 2 of them, okay? And this is Law Module 1, Units 1 through 3. And it has all kinds of case, here's a Maastricht Treaty in New Europe, a couple of chapters from a book. And then they gave us a list of readings in addition to this. And you would go through it and you would put down, I notice here, I started this one on January 26, 1997. I completed it on February 8th, 1997. I remarked the days that I read Chapter 7 of Weatherhill and Beaumont, Craig and Debuchy. And the interesting thing about this was that for 2 years, all practical purposes, I gave up every Saturday and Sunday of my life to this. Because the psychic income. And I graduated well in my class. And I have at home about 12 of these. I have maybe 25 books that I had to buy to go with it. Spent probably $2,000 or so in books. And it was my psychic income. And I graduated. I was 59 years old, just about to turn 60. And an absolute worthless degree in terms of, someone would say, as an economic matter. I loved it. As you know, I've written numerous law review articles published in major law reviews around this country. And in most cases, they were the lead article. So, I've learned that, if you're going to have a good law review article, it has to be at least 50 pages and 350 to 75 footnotes. You just, I enjoyed the writing of them. It gave me a sense of personal satisfaction that I was able to do this. I can say, I know, I wanted to teach a course at your university at Knoxville in the law school on common market economics. At that point in time, they had none, and I offered to do it. And the man that declined on the hiring of adjunct faculty says he wasn't sure I was terribly qualified. Well, I had more law review articles written in the past 7 years than he had in the 25 years he had been on the faculty at UT. And I've written more law review articles, had more published than my whole class, and then some. And I had, some really bright people like Brad Reed in Nashville, who graduated with me and was an editor of the Vanderbilt Law Review. But I mean, I've had all kinds of law review articles. I wanted to do more, but frankly, I've tired, frankly. And I haven't had the daily association of The Economist or the Financial Times, and so I'm really not as current as I should be to assume doing an article.
Let's bring you back to the local bar.
Yeah.
Were you active in the local bar association over the years?
I tell you what, I've held office in more things then I have toes and fingers. But I've never held office in the local bar. And I don't think it's that they didn't like me. It's just that I was always doing something else. And there's a pattern. If you want to be president of the Kingsport Bar Association, you agree to be treasurer. And you go through 3 steps. And then you're automatically president as long as you can read and walk. And so, I've never now have been active in the Tennessee Bar. I was chairman of the labor law section. And at the time, I didn't think much of the Tennessee Bar. I felt that I really wasn't getting anything from my dues. And I'm elated over the fact that I'm still alive in 50 years, so I now get my free dues. So I feel like I'm getting a little something back. But how it, your presidency of the bar convinced me that the Bar Association can be a valuable entity for the Tennessee lawyer. And every Tennessee lawyer ought to be a member of the Tennessee Bar Association, period. When I get up in the morning and I come in here and I might get a cup of coffee, the first thing I do is go to the Tennessee Bar webpage today to read the cases. I would not dream of letting 2 days go by without reading them. The Bar Association has done an invaluable service. I mean, I had law review articles in the Tennessee Bar Journal when Billy Bethel, yes, we're head of it. And, it was a nice publication. And it gave me, things about Tennessee law that I needed to know. But today, when they put the Today in, they gave every lawyer in this state the most current. Now, I have a lawyer friend in this town. We walked by his office, so we're not going to mention his name. But he still gets the advance sheets. Now, why in God's name anyone would get the advance sheets is absolutely beyond me. But he does.
Did you ever participate in the activities of the trial lawyers?
No. No, I never participated in the trial lawyers. The trial lawyers and I just have a difference of opinion, and that I don't want to be tagged philosophically in a box. And I think the trial lawyers, everyone thinks of the trial lawyers in terms of automobile accidents and, ambulance chasing and all that sort of thing. And I'm just uncomfortable with the Tennessee trial lawyers.
You've touched on it, but what value do you see in the organized bar for lawyers in our state? And it may be different one group to another, but what's the value of the organized bar?
Education. The bar every day does not pick and choose the cases I'm going to read. And so therefore I have an opportunity to pick and choose in reading. The organized bar is not as effective with the legislature as we might like. And that's very simple. We don't have any members there. And the reason we don't have any members is that no one can afford to sit in the General Assembly and practice law, unless you're with a massive firm that wants you to play lobbyist half the time. So that the organized bar is absolute essential. Every lawyer ought to be a member of it. And every lawyer, when they get up in the morning and after they've shaved and showered, or if they don't shave and they fix their hair, then, and I have to remember that because there were only 2 girls in law school with me, that, they need to come in and look at Tennessee Bar Today, TBH Today. I mean, it's a wonderful publication. It's the cheapest education you can get. And I commend you for having started it.
Do you think that the importance and the value of the organized bar has changed over the years that you've been at the bar?
Yes. Yeah, at one time it was a political entity that pushed for lawyers, that we did everything. We took care of the bar. We took care of ourselves. And we didn't give a damn about anyone else. But now we have a different role, and that's education.
We've seen some changes in the law and the responsibilities imposed upon lawyers over the years. Here's an example. What is your impression? What are your thoughts about mandatory CLE?
Absolutely. Let me tell you, I'm 77, and I probably have 38 hours toward next year. I personally filed a petition in front of the Supreme Court when they were considering removing the 65, and my personal petition said it ought not to be removed at all. I'm of the opinion that if I have a law license and I'm out there on the streets of Kingsport asking people to hire me, by God, I ought to have my hours. I ought to know what's going on. This idea that the fact that I'm 77, I'm a repository of all brilliance of the legal profession is outrageous. In fact, I probably need it more than Bart Rowlett, my young associate, who remembers everything from his bar cram course, and I don't remember anything about that. But if you're going to practice law, you ought to know what you're talking about, and you ought to be taking mandatory these courses. And some of them think, well, I'm 65, I'll just write in and get my waiver. I don't believe that. I don't think they should. And so what they finally did was chicken out the Supreme Court and made it 70. Now, as you know, Howard, from our days on the Adr Commission, some people tried to use that provision of age 65 to keep them from not taking our mandatory continuing mediation education. And Judge Memphis.
Brown.
What?
Judge Brown?
No.
Judge Holder?
Judge Holder. Judge Holder made it very clear that it was two different rules. One applied to lawyers, the other applied to mediators, and we could have ours that was different than the lawyers. And so, we don't have a rule. I mean, to this point, if you want to remain as a mediator and stick your hand out for money, by God, you better go to your CLE.
In bringing up the Adr Commission, I need to ask you a few questions about your involvement with the Commission over the years. When did you first go on the Adr Commission? I
was appointed to the Adr Commission, I want to say, in 94, 96. By the Supreme Court, and it was just setting it up. It was the initial commission. And I served consecutively for 19 years.
When the commission was beginning,
yes,
and there was discussion about the use of ADR in Tennessee, what were your thoughts about the value that ADR could bring to our citizens?
I was really up in the air. I wasn't sure. I've learned since then it's been a great service to the people of Tennessee.
You actually serve as a mediator in addition to your work as a lawyer.
Yes.
Have you enjoyed your experience as a mediator?
Yes, I do like mediation. I don't get to do the type of mediation I'd like to do, which is in the area of the law that I'm most familiar. I think there's a feeling sometimes people don't want to, there aren't that many labor lawyers around. And if I'm hearing a labor law matter as a mediator and I resolve it, the chances are that one of the parties I'm going to see down the street in another case when I'm on the other side. And I don't think lawyers like that. I enjoy my work as an arbitrator, too, for Finra.
When did you begin service as a certified Finra arbitrator?
20 years ago, 15 years ago.
How many arbitrations have you administered?
Oh, Lord. A number. let's say this. FINRA, we have a lot of tendency of settling them just prior to hearing. I currently have pending 22 cases in Puerto Rico, all involving UBS and all the situation there. And I expect some of them will be actually heard. But I've had some pretty prominent ones. People can go and look at my cases. They're published. They're available on the computer. I've had cases where I've been involved in the awarding of judgments in the hundreds, thousands of dollars, up to $1 million and more.
Is your work as an arbitrator usually as the single arbitrator or on a panel of 3?
It's normally a panel of 3. Probably 90% of the time I'm chairman. I only have one right now where it's a panel of 1.
What does FINRA stand for? And that's actually a successor organization,
yes.
isn't it?
FINRA is the successor to the New York Stock Exchange system and the National Association of Security Dealers. FINRA stands for the Financial Industries Regulatory Authority.
Why don't we take just a few minutes break?
All right, good.
Bruce, throughout your lifetime and your career, there have been times in the history of our country where things changed dramatically based upon certain events. And being the thoughtful person that you are, there are several events in our history that I'd like to ask you about. And if you could tell us what your reaction, what effect these events had on you. And we'll start with the assassination of President Kennedy.
The assassination of President Kennedy was just a blow to a belief in a system. What I remember most was walking through the student center and the bookstore to the postal boxes in the student center at Vanderbilt and hearing it on television. That impact that we would do something like that, because we had not really had an assassination since Lincoln, or no, Garfield.
Unfortunately, the next one is another assassination, and that would be the assassination of Martin Luther King.
I was working for Hubert Humphrey, and we were getting ready to go to Louisville. And Martin Luther King had a brother who was a preacher in Louisville. I've been trying to think of the name of the mayor of Louisville at the time. He had been a big Roosevelt person. And I was there getting ready for Humphrey to speak in a day, maybe 2 days. And the assassination came on. And I was asked by the mayor and A.D. Williams King, maybe that was his name, the brother. And we drove around Louisville, and wherever groups were, the pastor would get out and the mayor would get out, and they'd say, we even sent someone from the vice president's office. The one thing that made the greatest impression upon me was a sign that had been almost watered out of any vitality, vibrancy, that said it was going to be a housing project. And never really occurred. And I could see why blacks would be frustrated. And here in this wonderful town of Louisville, there's a sign that there were going to be this wonderful housing section, you know, individual houses and all the rest. And the sign had been up so damn long that it just watered away.
What about the effect and impact upon you for the Bobby Kennedy assassination?
I was working for Humphrey. We were getting ready for Humphrey going to Cincinnati. And I'm sitting in the hotel, Sheridan Hotel, in that square in Cincinnati that everyone knows where the federal court's on. And there's a humorous part of it. And I hear about it, and I'm waiting to hear from the vice president's office as to what I'm going to do. Of course, we didn't have, you know, staggered phones and all that crap. What you did was you get a phone in your room and you picked it up and someone would tell you. I had a man working for me in that trip named Sam Sterrett. He's probably still alive. Sam Sterrett, I have never understood at that time why he was assigned to me. And they said, you take good care of him. He's going to be part of your advance team, and you just tell him whatever you want done to be done. And I said, well, I said to him, I want this auditorium to look like a good auditorium. Humphrey was speaking to the state AFL-CIO convention. So I want to make sure we have all the balloons and all the rest. And the assassination comes in. And Sterrett comes in and said, well, we need to issue a press release, and we need to stop. And I said, go fix the balloons. I said, we continue to do our job until we're told not to. And I want you back at that auditorium making sure balloons are up. About 6 months later, I found out why Sterrett had been assigned to me. He was waiting for the Senate to hear his nomination to be a judge on the U.S. tax court. He ultimately became chief judge of the U.S. tax court. But he sure as didn't know what to do about it. He thought that because I had a title that I could issue a press release, and I said I didn't issue press releases in the name of the vice president.
What impact, what effect did the circumstances of 9/11 have upon you?
This may sound terribly shallow, but nothing. And I say that because it was an event that had to be resolved, that had to be responded to. I had no personal stake in it. And therefore, I was prepared to do what was needed to be done, whatever I was supposed to do as a citizen.
We've had many changes in the practice of law during your career, perhaps some good, some bad?
Yes, clearly.
Let's run through a list.
All right.
Advertising.
The worst thing that ever happened to the legal profession.
Technology.
Fine for people who grow up with it. Hard for people that have to slide in late in life.
How business is developed.
I think it goes to advertising.
Big firm versus small firm.
We've always had that. That's nothing different.
Public's perception of the courts.
Sad. I think there's we don't have the opinion that we once had, and that's because of the partisan political atmosphere on both sides, liberal and conservative, on looking and not understanding what we do as lawyers and why cases are decided the way they are.
Clients' expectations and relationships with their lawyers.
Clients always want to win, and they always expect their lawyer to win. And, you know, there's a client expectation. You know, you represent them and you win, and you're the best damn lawyer since sliced bread. And then about, 8 months later, they kind of figured that they could have done it themselves. And then down the road even further, they don't even remember who you are. And you spent weekend after weekend working on their cases away from your family.
Bench and bar relationships.
They're not as close as they once were, I think. And I think that's because of the size of the bar and the fact that judges have to be very sensitive in this day and age with the misconceptions that saying hello to someone has, or smiling at someone, and the general public not understanding civility in the profession, and they expect you to be an attack dog.
Speaking of judges, were you ever interested in becoming one?
Yes. I was interested in being a judge on the Tennessee Supreme Court, and I did make the list of 3 that was presented to Governor Bredesen, and he appointed, in his infinite wisdom, Miss Lee, who has been a very good judge, and in retrospect, I understand completely why he did it, and I told him that before he left office, that I was 69 years old asking for a job of our Chief Justice from Chattanooga, who was retiring at 65, and here I was at 69 trying to do the job, and I knew I could do it, and I still could do it. I could do it today. But on the surface, Justice Lee will have a greater impact upon the court's development of the law than I ever would, because I'm not going to live as long as her.
What are the qualities that make a good judge?
Compassion, intelligence, caring about the profession, being concerned about your... the reason I wanted to be on the Tennessee Supreme Court, the lawyer in Knoxville I always admired named Barry Bernstein, Bernard, and he spoke on behalf of Judge Tipton, no, not Tipton, the congressman's, what's his name in Knoxville?
Duncan.
Duncan. He spoke on behalf of John Duncan's, who wanted the brother, Joe Duncan, I guess it was.
For the judgeship, it would have been Jimmy.
Jimmy, for the judgeship on the Court of Criminal Appeals. Okay, and in his remarks, he said that he supported Duncan because the job of an appellate lawyer is to be the law professor to the profession. And in my application for the court, I was asked a question, you know, about what you believe, what you want to do. And I quoted that as an important thing, in my opinion, and that I felt appellate judges were, in fact, the law professors to the profession, and that we had a very high standard to meet, and an educated one. I can remember when I first came to the bar, they had a Tennessee opinion consisted of quotes from Carruthers' History of a Lawsuit, the Gibson suits in Chancery, and Corpus Juris. And, you know, we've come a long way, but we've not gone as far as we should. And I think the Rule 11 has been helpful in that the court does not have to take everything. It can be more selective, and they can do a better job in their scholarship of an opinion.
What are the qualities that make a good lawyer?
This may sound strange. I think it depends what type of lawyer you are. I think you need to be a caring person if you're going to be out there representing the general public in day-to-day commerce and what have you. I don't think you have to be such a caring person if you're going to be sitting and doing deeds and other things. But I would say that compassion for people. I mean, we are put on earth to serve. You know, serving requires a sense of caring for people. And to me, that is the most important thing a lawyer must have, is caring about people. and wanting to reach out and help them, and particularly in cases where, you know, the party is wrong. You know, one of the most difficult things for a lawyer is telling his client they're wrong. And there are too damn many lawyers that won't. And you know, lose a case and then blame the other side, blame the judge, you know, or some such foolishness, and never sat down with their client and said, I'm sorry, but your case is no good. I always tell my clients, the last thing in the world you ever need is a doctor or a lawyer that tells you what you want to hear. They're the expensive ones. And I take that, I see a lot of people. 90% of the people I see do not have a lawsuit. Now, I know I could send them to somewhere else and someone would file something for them that ultimately they'd lose and waste a lot of money. I feel an obligation not to take those sort of cases, and I won't, and I haven't.
Bruce, we've talked today about your education and the extent of it. We've talked about your family. We've talked about practicing here in East Tennessee and in 19 other states. We've talked about your political activities and your work in Washington and other things that you have done. But I know from your resume that there are other activities in your life that have been extraordinarily important to you, and I'd like to talk about 3 of them.
Okay.
And the first one is the Sovereign Military Order of the Temple of Jerusalem. Tell us about that organization and your participation.
That organization is an organization that was, it does not go back to the original Templars. We have all the paraphernalia of a Templar. And we are basically a Christian charitable organization. And one of our main functions is to support the churches and the Christian sites in Jerusalem. Because rapidly Palestinian Christians are leaving the area. And Arab Christians, they are different than Palestinian. They too are leaving the area. And the great problem is that the Christian community in this area, Arab and Palestinian, doesn't belong to anyone. It doesn't belong to Israel because they're not Jewish, and it doesn't belong to the Arab community because they're Christians, Muslim, and so they're all by themselves. And so, and the church sites that people go to see, we support them. We dump a lot of money into Jerusalem every year, hundreds of thousands of dollars, with an organization that in this country probably doesn't have 2,000 members. And we are very strong about that.
How did you become introduced to this organization?
I became introduced to a man named Larry Long here in Kingsport, and also through Norman Worrell, who was the executive director of the Tennessee Arts Commission when I was chairman, but he and I got to know, we always stayed in touch years later. And he was very involved in the organization.
Have you actually served on their boards and in other activities related to the promotion of the organization?
Yes, I have been the prior of the Priory of St. Andrew. St. Andrews.
Would you explain what a priory is?
A priory is a subdivision of the organization. It includes, the Priory of St. Andrew includes all of Tennessee, North Alabama, Western North Carolina, and Southwest Virginia, up to Blacksburg. And it's the largest priory in the organization. And I have held a number of offices, and the last one being prior, which is the chief person. And so, in that sense, I directed the organization.
Among the many things that you have done, why is this organization important to Bruce Shine?
Because it's caring for some people that other people aren't caring for. I'm on the board of the General Raymond Davis Foundation, which is a vehicle of the sovereign military order for us to give money. It's a 501c3. Oddly enough, the sovereign military order is incorporated under a fraternal order thing. Raymond Davis was in World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. He was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor in in Korea, and retired from the Marines as Vice Commandant of the whole Marines. We have a foundation of about 7 people. His son is one of them. His son is a retired United States magistrate judge from Florida. And I serve on, and what we do there is exclusively pay for scholarships for Palestinian Christians to obtain an education. We have scholarships for nurses. We require that they stay for 3 years afterwards to help the community. We pay for tuition. For the Episcopal Church, for instance, sponsors a school for hotel service and the service industry, which is very important in Jerusalem. And we pay for scholarships there. My wife and I have sponsored a girl, for 3 or 4 years at a Russian Orthodox school. We call it Sister Martha's School, but it's the Russian Orthodox Church School in Bethany. And this girl graduated this year. Education there is not free. When you're talking about secondary school, I've been to Israel and what have you. And we originally started, our schools were 70% Christian. It's now down to 50–60%. The other is Muslim. These are all the Lutheran, the Episcopal, what have you, churches sponsoring these schools. And we find that if you go to school with someone, you don't normally end up shooting them. I've learned that from the Ulster Project that Betsy was chairman of in terms of Northern Ireland. And so we educate and we encourage the fact that, in some cases, one school is 70% Muslim and 30% Christian. And one of the Episcopal schools that is there. So I think that's a primary goal in life, and I'm involved in it.
You spoke earlier of the efforts and philosophy of Clarence Strite,
right,
and his concern for the establishment of a union of democracies.
Right.
I understand you serve as the chair of the board for the Strite Council?
Yes, I do. I serve on the board of 2 entities, the Strite Council and another entity called Association to Unite the Democracies, Inc., from which the Strite Council was begat. I'm chairman of the board of both of them. We're basically think tanks. We have a web page, a blog, and we put out papers all the time on various aspects of Britain leaving the EU is the latest blog we have. But we constantly put out blogs on Atlantic affairs and European Union affairs and their relationships to the United States.
Why is the Strite Council important to you?
Because I thought Clarence Strite was a brilliant man and did much for America. And I am distressed over the fact that a lot of people don't remember or don't know who the hell he was. And so I have worked diligently, and we are in a project that we are funding for a book on Clarence Strite that Dr. Tiziana Stella is writing, and we're going to publish that. And we're going to give thousands of copies away.
Bruce, we're here in your offices today, and
Yes.
I noticed as we were coming in the front door that there's an adjacent office that is related. Your name's on a desk in there. Could you tell us about that?
Well, that's the consulate for the Republic of Malta. I'm the honorary consul for the Republic of Malta for Tennessee and the Carolinas, and North Carolina. And I taught at the International taught EU employment law at the International Maritime Law Institute, which has normally around 30 students, 22 of them from 22 different countries. The International Maritime Law Institute is a division of the International Maritime Organization, which is a part of the United Nations. While teaching there, I got to know the president of Malta, who is a law professor, DeMarco. And President DeMarco would come out to the campus, because we have our own building there. And across from that building is part of the university and the law school. And DeMarco never gave up being a law professor, even though he was president of the country. And he would come out with 2 or 3 motorcycles in front of him with flags on his Mercedes-Benz and teach his class. And then get back in. And it was not unusual for me to see the president 2 or 3 times a day. And they asked me if I would be interested in being consul, because I did not have one in this part of the country. There are only 8 honorary consuls, I think it's about 8, in North America. The ambassador from Malta to the United States is also ambassador, high commissioner to Canada. Because it's a Commonwealth country, they're high commissioners, not ambassadors. He's also high commissioner to the Bahamas. At one time, he was also high commissioner to Mexico, but they decided that was a bit much territory, so they dropped the Mexico part. And there are about 8 or 9 what we call resident consuls, where we have an actual embassy and station an ambassador. England, for instance, clearly, you know, France, Russia. And Malta is, you know, a little over 400,000 people. And when I was asked if I would like to be the honorary consul, I thought that was a pretty nice deal. Of course, most people don't know where Malta is, and Malta is south of Sicily and north of Tunisia and Libya. And so it sits there in the center of the Mediterranean, and during World War II was bombed more heavily than Great Britain was. And every time the Italians, who didn't want to really get involved in a battle, wanted to drop some bombs, they'd come and drop them over Malta. And the Germans did too. And the story of Malta is a very interesting one, and about its defense for freedom in World War II. And the most important thing is a beautiful, on the presidential palace in downtown Valletta, the capital of Malta, there is a plaque and with a citation from King George VI, who bestowed upon the people of Malta the Order of George VI. And not to the government, not to its generals or anything, but to the people who had put up with all this bombing and all the rest. And the presidential palace, there's that there, and then there's a thing from Roosevelt. And on the flag, when Malta got its independence, it took the flag, the order of George VI, and put it in the upper right hand, in the upper left-hand corner of its flag. And there it sits. Even though it is no longer a British colony, it has this order from the British monarch on its flag.
When did you begin your service as an honorary consul for Malta?
Probably in the early 2003, 2004, something like that. I have the distinction, I may be the dean of the diplomatic corps in Tennessee, in that we have 9 diplomatic representatives in Tennessee. In Memphis, we have Canada, an honorary consul. We have in Memphis, I want to say a Brazilian or a Guatemalan. There's another there, but I can't remember. And then in Nashville, we have German, a Danish, vice consul for Italy, and we have one for Great Britain. And then in Knoxville, yes, and then we have one for the Japanese. It's the only career consulate in the state. The difference being it's made up of employees of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. One of the nice things about being a quote diplomat in Tennessee is that I'm invited every year to the Emperor's birthday party. and I've never attended because it's very precise, between 5 and 7 at the Marriott Hotel by the airport. And you have to bring your card and all the rest because you know, the Japanese moved their consulate to Nashville after Katrina. And the influx of Japanese companies in Tennessee made it a rational thing to do. So their Southeast United States consulate is there. And then Slovenia opened up a consulate a few years back in Knoxville, and I'm here. When I was originally appointed, John Lowell, the ambassador, called me one day. He said, the State Department is not too keen about making you honorary consul being in Kingsport. They don't understand. And they said they would understand if I was in Nashville or Memphis because that would, you know, have some economic reasons. And I said, well, John, just tell them this, that my jurisdiction will run from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, and that Kingsport is dead middle.
How frequently are you called upon to exercise your powers as consul?
Not often, but often enough. It's sort of like being like the Maytag repairman. When something happens, it really happens. I've had situations where ships came into port in Wilmington, North Carolina, under the Greek flag, and they were sold. And I had to, through emails and what have you, transfer their papers in Lloyd's of London on the ship registry and all the rest. And in 24 hours, got all this paperwork done to change this ship's registration. And then the captain and the harbor master at Wilmington really wanted the ship out because he had another ship out there waiting to come in and take his slot. But my now Maltese ship captain wouldn't leave because he didn't have a Maltese flag. Well, fortunately, I represented a union in New Jersey of the textile workers that made flags. And 90% of the employees were Vietnamese. They made the flag that flew in the World's Fair in Knoxville, that massive one. And they overnighted me 2 flags from New York to New Jersey to Wilmington, and the captain had his flags, and off he went. I've had that. I've had citizenship things. I've had many different issues.
Bruce,
all of which I don't get paid for.
I'd like to turn from your professional activities, your volunteer activities, the the service that you have provided to these organizations and other circumstances to your home life.
Okay.
But first,
kind of personal, isn't it?
Well, a little bit, a little bit.
I'm only joking.
But first, as we have spent the day talking about your career,
yes,
you have accomplished what it would take 4 or 5 other normal human beings to do. How do you use your time so effectively to accomplish so much? What's the secret?
I don't know. I really don't, Howard. I believe in life you set priorities and you decide what's important, and then you do it. And how you make that decision, a host of things. I made a decision to help these Christian children in Palestine, having gone to Israel a few times and been there and knowing about the plight that they face. That's important. I know about it. I should do something about it. Other things, Clarence Strite was very kind to me and very nice to me as a young man. I mean, I knew him through Kefauver when I was a teenager. And then, you know, worked for him, and he was a difficult man to work for. But he was a genius, and he believed in something that I believe in too. And so I have an obligation there. So I don't know how you set your priorities. You know, maybe I don't do a very good job. I've been very fortunate, very lucky. People have been very kind to me. Estes Kefauver being the most. I don't know how to answer your question.
There are only 24 hours in the day. Do you require any sleep?
Yes, I require a lot of sleep, as a matter of fact. But I don't waste my time either. I live in a PUD, Planned Unit Development. I'm president of it too, and have been for about 25 years or so. And you know, upgraded everything in the last 10 years. Spent over almost $750,000 without increasing any of the monthly assessment. When Betsy and I built this, there are 13 buildings and on 17 acres. And 6 units in each building. And we live in one that was built for us to our specifications as to what we wanted internally. I felt, and we did it on the basis that Betsy is now in her 20th year as a Sullivan County election commissioner. She has been active in the junior league. She's been active in everything. She's been president of the Fine Arts Center in Kingsport, head of the Renaissance Center, which is an area that I'm now chairman of because it houses the Senior Citizen Center. I'm chairman of the Senior Citizen Center. Advisory Council. We decided that we were going to build something that we didn't feel boys came back. If they got a divorce, they didn't come back and live with you. Girls did. We didn't have any girls. Even Betsy used to say the damn dog was a female. And we decided, for instance, I was in my 30s, early 30s, that the width of a stairwell to put a chair to come up and down, so that when I reached the point that I couldn't walk up and down the stairs, I had this little elevated chair to bring me up and down. Our living structure, Betsy always said all I really needed in life was a hotel suite. And it is almost a hotel suite on one floor. And there, in another floor, there are rooms and various activities.
Well, okay, let's talk about home. You're an avid reader. I know
Yes.
you have been your entire life. What are you reading now?
I'm in the last couple of pages of a book by Baldacci, the mystery writer, called Guilty. It's an amazing book, and you know, there's a lot of blood and guts and all the rest. I'm also reading Jerry Phillips' book on Judge Ralston Schofield, and I have a series of books. My son David is the type that will send you a box of books. He does this, and then he'll say, "We'll talk about it later." In other words, you know, you're going to have to give a book report. So I must have 17 books. You said, you know, beside my bedside. I mean, they're everywhere. You know, they're stacked up.
The Summers you mentioned, is that our Chattanooga lawyer friend
Jerry Summers? Jerry Summers, a very nice guy, a very good, competent lawyer, and he's written this book about Ralston Schofield and the great trial in Nashville when they impeached Schofield. Schofield ran for governor as a segregationist and what have you, and he and Frank Clement drew at odds. I mentioned earlier that John J. Hooker John J. was a good friend of mine, and he could be a pain in the neck, but he a man of great principle. And as he got older, maybe an annoyance to people, but he was always faithful to his beliefs. And in the course of that case, Judge Schofield said to John Jay, who was then a young lawyer assisting, who was it that prosecuted? I forget. But anyway, be that as it may, the prosecuting attorney against Schofield. Judge Schofield went up to John Jay and said to John Jay, he said, "You're the Duke of Belmead." And John Jay said, "Why do you call me that?" And he said, "Because you're no count." And that's one of the books I'm reading. I haven't finished Jerry's book. I'm looking forward to finishing it.
You seem to have an interest both in fiction and nonfiction.
Yes.
Are there other fiction writers of interest?
You know, that's interesting because I move. There's a Louise Penny, a Canadian writer, who does mysteries. She has a new book out. Elizabeth George, I'm very fond of. You know, they kind of come and go with your life. I mean, some of them, you know, stop writing, they die. And, you know, Elizabeth George writes an awfully long book. And Louise Penny, they're great Canadian mysteries.
If I asked you if there are 3 books you consider among the favorite that you have ever read, what would you say?
Well, that's impossible to name 3, but I will name one. I think every lawyer in America needs to read this book. Now, it's odd that I mention it because yesterday afternoon on C-SPAN, I'm flipping around the channel and I come across Mr. Lamb, who has been the foundation of C-SPAN. And he is interviewing Smith, who is 85, 84, and he has just published a book on Bush, which is less than complimentary, and I say Bush, George W., not Herbert Walker. And the book is an interesting one, but Smith writes a lot of, has done a lot of biographies on presidents, okay? To be a lawyer in this country, you have to know John Marshall. You have to know the basis of Marshall. I have a brochure that my son David gave me on John Marshall on the 250th birthday, which occurred some years ago in 2005. But John Marshall set the tone and the tenor of the law in this country and in the Supreme Court. And that's what bothers me about the current dispute regarding the Supreme Court. It's so petty and so divisive as compared to Marshall and the way he was able to manipulate his colleagues and achieve basically what he wanted. But John Marshall set the tenor and the style of American jurisprudence. Yes, we had it from the Brits, but he put an American touch and flavor to it. You know, you can go to Canada and you go into Toronto and go into the Toronto Supreme Court, and they still got wigs and, you know, and all that. And we never went that way. So it's a very different thing. And the New York Times, notable book of 1996. I think for every lawyer, if you don't know about John Smith and you haven't read this book or haven't read a book about John Marshall, you're dumb.
You mentioned C-SPAN. Do you watch TV?
Not that often. I watch TV for news and then turn it off before it gets me, bites me, and has me watch more. There's so much, you know, there's a lot of things, good things on TV, but it interferes with my reading.
If we were to make a movie of your life, who would you select to play the role of Bruce Shine?
You know, Howard, that's the most intriguing question. Because I have not darkened the interior of a movie theater in probably 25 years. We have, you know, taken out some films on occasion from Netflix or something like that. Betsy does that. I could barely tell you who a movie star is today, let alone who ought to play me. You know, I'm liable to say Gregory Peck. And I really kind of like that.
I don't think he's available.
No. So, you know, I don't know an answer to that because that's a part of my life. You know, some people are very much into films, and there's nothing wrong with that. And there's, you know, it's a perfectly legitimate interest, but it's just not mine.
Are you an avid computer user?
Oh, I can use my computer to do emails and respond and set my schedule and do things like that. Yes, I use the computer because in this day and age I have to. Do I know that much about it? No, I have. I often find myself at least once or twice a week saying, "Bart, come in," and Bart, my young associate, who you know, knows all about computers because he's grown up with them and used with them and went to law school using them. And so it's an entirely different situation.
Do you Google things?
No. I might put something in if I'm looking for some information. Yeah, in that sense, I will Google. If I'm looking, I use it quite often for that, for information purposes.
Do you use a smartphone?
I have a phone that I open up maybe twice a month when I want to make a phone call. I hate phone calls. So I don't use one. I don't know. My wife does, Miss Betsy, and I often have to have people help me with that. I'm just not very adept at smartphones.
Do you write your articles and papers with a computer, on paper, or through dictation?
I sit down with a yellow pad and write everything in a long, now letters and things like that, I dictate. But my newspaper column, I sit down and write. My law review articles, I always sat down and wrote, including the footnotes. I just felt more comfortable in having more control over it. And my mother taught me about writing a column because she did column. that, you know, you put the first sentence and the last sentence, then you fill the middle, because you need to know where you were going and where you're going to end up.
Why haven't you written a novel?
You know, that's interesting, because I have often thought of writing a novel, and I thought of doing a kind of a quasi-mystery spy novel. When I worked for NATO, I was loaned on occasion to a group, and I would deliver messages in Rome and do things like that. I thought about it. I thought about it, but I just haven't gone that far. And maybe it's, you know, age is creeping up on me. I'm not sure.
I think I know the answer to this question, but are you ever going to retire?
You know, if I have to retire, it'll be because of my health. This law firm I've enjoyed. You know, I intend for Bart to have it all. You know, you can't. I don't want to sell secondhand desks and file cabinets and what have you. He's very, very bright. I've been very fortunate in that he came to me, Mercer graduate, middle upper part of his class, and he had worked 3 years, all 3 years in law school at Mercer, in a law firm as clerk. While he was at East Tennessee State University, he worked for one of these Social Security law firms for 4 years. So he came to me with 7 years of experience in the practice of law, but couldn't find a job. Half his class from Mercer. This is, it will be 5 years ago, this spring, this fall. And he, you know, it just didn't make sense. And he wanted to talk about the practice of law, which I knew what he meant was he wanted a job. And so I talked to him, and I gave him some things to do, and I was in need of someone to help me because I had lost a partner, and I had these health issues, very serious health issues, and I was alone. And he did a great job. And as a result of that, I decided to hire him. I've never paid him what he's worth. And I intend to be of counsel. I've told him a very funny story about when I was a young lawyer his age. I was in New York. I was involved representing the International Printing Pressmen's Union. And we had a plant in Manhattanville, Kansas, McCall Pattern Company. And they took tissues of these patterns that women used and folded them and all the rest. And the firm was a Proskauer Rose firm in New York. And I went there, and myself as the young lackey associate, and this young lackey associate for the Proskauer firm, said to me, did I want to see Judge Proskauer? Well, I really had no great desire to see Judge Proskauer, but anyway, I said, sure. And so he brings me down a hallway to a corner office, and there sits this old man with the New York Times in front of him, and he's half asleep like this. And he says, that's Judge Proskauer. Judge Proskauer was around 93, 94, and of course he was of counsel. And part of the thing was that he was sort of like a sugar for ants. And that in New York, his name was very good, and it brought business. And I may try to play Judge Proskauer.
What is the greatest challenge facing the legal profession as we sit here today?
Oh, my goodness gracious. To have the American people have faith in the system and know that we are honest and noble individuals, and that when they come to us and tell us their woes and their wills, that we will care about it, and that we will treat them fairly and honestly, and that they need not worry about going somewhere else to find an honest resolution of their problem. That's the most important thing, that the public continue to have faith in the integrity of our profession, which requires their belief in the courts and the ability of the courts to do the right thing. It's one of the things that bothers me about this whole current posture of the vacancy on the Supreme Court. Our system won't work if people don't have faith in it, and they're going to have faith in the judges, and they have to have faith in the fact that when they hire a lawyer, they're going to get an advocate, a fighter, okay, and not someone that will sell them out or just take their money and go on their way. No, we need people that when someone says, my lawyer, do so with a sense of admiration, and know that our court system is fair and honest and right and just, and that, in fact, we believe in all this.
Bruce, I have, excuse me, two final questions.
Okay.
Before I lose my voice.
Okay.
Is there a question that I didn't ask that I should have today?
No. No.
So here's the final question. You've shown great dedication to your family, community, country, and profession.
Yes.
Why?
Why did God put me on earth? But to serve. I have an obligation. Bring children in the world, I have an obligation to take care of them. Someone comes to me and says, I have this problem, and I assume their problem, I have an obligation. It's that simple.
Bruce, thank you very much for your time today, and may God continue to bless you and Betsy going forward.
Thank you.
Thank you.